Good morning and/or afternoon to everyone, and welcome to our second day of the Menus of Change Leadership Summit Virtual Edition. We hope you enjoyed yesterday's sessions and came away with some great takeaways around business strategies for supporting personal and planetary health. Thank you to our program sponsors for helping us bring this virtual summit to you tuition-free. Please make sure to visit them in the Sustainability Innovation Hub during the networking and reception today and chat with them just as you would if we were all convened together in the Marriott Pavilion at Hyde Park. We know we threw a lot at you yesterday, so if there's anything you missed or want to revisit, you can find all of the presentations, recipes, as well as recordings of the sessions on the Summit Materials page of our website, menusofchange.org, with the password that was emailed earlier this week. And we've got an incredible lineup for you today as well, including more breakout sessions, meet the author booths, and opportunities to network with other attendees. And we want to know how you are operationalizing these large-scale personal and planetary health issues. Today's first poll question is up and running on the polls tab. Do you have a sustainable seafood sourcing program in place? Because when we talk about planetary sustainability, there tends to be a lot of focus on the earth and our agricultural systems, as well as the air with our emissions, but water covers 71% of the Earth's surface. So here to moderate our next session on blue food is Fabrice DeClerck, the science director at EAT Foundation, and also a member of the Blue Food Assessment Core team. Fabrice will be introducing our next presenters as well as moderating Q&A afterwards. So please put questions for our presenters at any time in the chat, and we'll get to those during the Q&A after. Welcome, Fabrice.
Great. Thanks, Jackie. Thanks for that introduction. It's great to be with you all today. And welcome to all of you. I'm Fabrice DeClerck, Science Director at EAT. I've been working on the Atlantic Commission, and really over the past couple of years, filling in one of the gaps, I think, from that commission to focus on the role of blue foods, foods from aquatic ecosystems, rivers, streams, lakes, oceans, which, as Jackie pointed out, cover the majority of the land surface. So today's session is blue foods, oceans and fisheries, product innovation, and the professional kitchen. We've got three fantastic speakers to share with you today who will give global perspectives, dive into nutrition and health and the opportunities that blue foods present. And then we will end with a focus on innovation in seaweed, one of the even lesser remembered foods and opportunities that they do present. We'll have time for question and answer, so please do prepare to share questions for the panelists as they rise, and looking forward to that interactive session at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to present our first speaker. Professor Naylor is the founding director of the Center for Food Security and Environment and professor of economics at Stanford University. She's a serving fellow at Stanford's Wood Institute and the Freeman-Spogli Institute for National Studies. More important to me, however, is that Roz is the co-chair of the Blue Food Assessment with Beatrice Krona at the Stockholm Resilience Center. The Blue Food Assessment is an international collaboration of 100 scientists who are in the final steps of producing 9 research papers with the aim of helping to better understand the role of aquatic foods in global food systems now, but also in the future. How do we create future demand? How can blue foods help us to achieve goals in terms of improving health globally? What's their contribution in terms of living within planetary boundaries? So Roz will be the first speaker. Her research focuses on policies and practice to improve global food security and protect the environment on both land and sea. So she's a silo buster in that sense. She also works in many locations in the world. So she brings, I think, some very real field experience and place-based experience. And I think has published quite widely, both on intensive crop production, aquaculture, livestock systems, biofuels, climate change, food and price volatility. Really, I think an excellent voice to give us this big picture perspective on how blue foods fit into that puzzle. Roz, it's a pleasure to have you, and my pleasure also to hand over the floor to you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Fabrice. Great introduction and welcome to everybody. I thought I would just spend my time talking about the sustainability of blue foods and give you an overview. Next. And as Fabrice mentioned, I'm going to base this on the work that we've been doing through the Blue Food Assessment, which has been a very rigorous scientific assessment of the environmental, nutritional, equity, and justice implications of blue foods in the global food system. And I hope this serves as a great resource for you going forward. I know this is a tricky issue for chefs and retailers as you think about putting blue food on the table. So let's go through next a couple of myths. And I think one of the confusing issues is there are these silver bullets that are out there that may direct you in ways that then you question later. The first myth is that all fish production is bad. And I think many people here probably watched Seaspiracy, the film that really targeted unsustainable fishing practices, with the message that the best way to save fish and the oceans is just to stop eating fish. Next. The second myth is that aquaculture is always the most sustainable source of seafood. And the message here would be that you should always serve farm fish over wild-caught fish. Next. And third is that blue foods, the third myth is that blue foods always have a lower environmental footprint than terrestrial animal products, with the message, serve fish, not meat. And as you can see, there's some conflicting messages that you're having to grapple with. So I want to go through each quickly. Next. When we look at the first myth, all fish production is bad, and we look at the data here from the Food and Agricultural Organization, we can see in the top orange bar that the unsustainable capture of fish production has been increasing, and it's now over a quarter of the fish that are captured. But right below that, that big blue swath is sustainable practices. So there are a lot of fishers out there throughout the world trying to actually capture fish in a more sustainable way. The only thing that has really gone down is the percentage of fish that are underfished. We're really capturing all that we can capture in the oceans today. Next. And at least half of the fish that are produced, either captured or produced in aquaculture, are coming from smallholders, like you see here. And so if the decision is to not eat fish, you're also having implications for the livelihoods of millions of really poor and underprivileged people around the world. Next. So I think I'd like to rest on Daniel Pauly's response to the Seaspiracy film, where he said the message should not be to just stop eating fish. In fact, we should eat fish in ways that reward the sustainable fishing practices. But what we should do is really put our emphasis and energy around regulations that stop illegal practices and unsustainable practices that continue to be widespread. Next. So the second myth is that aquaculture is the most sustainable seafood source. And this is tuna farming in Australia using sardines from the west coast of California as the main source of feed. And one of the sustainability issues is how much wild fish are we using to actually produce farm fish. Next. I want to rely on science that we did in a review article published in March of 2021 in Nature on a 20-year retrospective review of aquaculture. I hope this also is a good resource for you. Next. And what we found looking back over 20 years is that aquaculture now accounts for over 50% of the fish that are on your plate, but most of the growth has actually been in these freshwater systems in places that you don't think about. This is Bangladesh, huge growth in freshwater systems, now accounting for over 75% of the edible weight of aquaculture produced worldwide. Next. And we also often think about these as being sustainable, and we think about them being mainly in Asia. We did a review also on consumption patterns around the world using the most recent data you can see here across different regions of the world. The yellow is what's in freshwater fish, consumed freshwater fish. And you can see Asia, vast majority is actually consuming freshwater fish. You want to know about the sustainability of those fish. But even in North America, Europe, we consume a lot of freshwater fish as well. Next. And so we think about them being more sustainable, but there are unsustainable practices as well. This is a picture of the Jacquelyn Reservoir in Indonesia. And if you look at all those little white dots out there, that's actually individual cages, just in a public resource, water resource that is way over intensified right now and unsustainable. Next. And many of the freshwater systems now do rely on feeds. Over 80% of tilapia and catfish, for example, use compound feeds in production. Next. There are sustainable practices like in Hainan for tilapia production, way underappreciated. So there's a lot of good exploration that can be done on localized sustainable practices. Next. But on the feeds, I want to give you some takeaway messages from our review. What we saw over the past 20 years is that there have been incredible improvements in feed conversion ratios. That is the wet feeds in to the wild fish out. And in particular, there's been a massive substitution away from fish meal and fish oil towards plant-based ingredients and recycled animal ingredients, and particularly trimmings coming from fish processing plants, and all sorts of new innovations, insect feeds and different macro and microalgae feeds. And so there's a lot of potential here to reduce fish meal and fish oil further. Next. And what we see overall, when we look back at 1997, the aquaculture industry used 1.9 tons of wild fish to produce 1 ton of farm fish globally across all fed species. And now we're only using 0.28 tons of wild fish to produce 1 ton of farm fish. So incredible improvements in the sector. Next. We've seen that the annual catch of forage fish to make fish meal and fish oil has declined over this period from 23 to 15 or 16 million metric tons. So again, a big improvement. But we've also seen that aquaculture's reliance on the marine resources continues. Right now, aquaculture is accounting for about 70% of global fish meal and about 75% of fish oil. And so its dependence on marine resources really still has to be watched very carefully, and it's worth paying attention to production practices. Next. There's also much tighter connection between land and sea right now. So when we think about unsustainable practices with terrestrial animal products, the corn we produce or the soy that are leading to nutrient loads and dead zones, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, or deforestation in South America, like Brazil. Now these same compound feeds are used in aquaculture. And this is a picture of yellow croaker that I took from China, but the same feed resources. So if we think about what we've seen in terrestrial animal products in the past, the industrialization of that sector, we are seeing it also in aquaculture. Next slide. Of course, there are extractive species that you'll hear about later, seaweed and algae, mollusks, and bivalve that don't rely on any kinds of feeds. This is a large seaweed operation and mollusk operation in China up above, and then much more niche operations that you see below. Next. And there's real unrealized potential, I think, in this sector. Producers don't really get enough value out of these systems to make it worthwhile yet. And so the real critical issue is how to improve the value, get it on the menus, really reward farmers for ecosystem services that they provide. I want to emphasize that these systems, the climate mitigation, the absorption of carbon really is still under investigation. We don't have conclusive evidence on that, but we do know that they can assimilate nutrients, especially when there are large-scale systems. Next. So let me just add, there's been rapid innovation in aquaculture, but we have all sorts of uncertainties, a lot of pathogens, pests, that a lot of antibiotics, antimicrobials still used in this sector. There's also pollution, harmful algal blooms, climate change that will affect the success of this sector. Next. And so let's move to these large raceways to the left, to the top right, the recirculated aquaculture systems, or bottom right, large offshore systems. These are all more sustainable in terms of these threats. Of course, you still need to look at the feed ingredients, but they're also much more expensive. So as chefs, as you're putting these sustainable options on the table, they will really go to more high-end consumers. Next. And of course, you have to make a decision now about genetically modified fish. Genetically modified salmon is heading to the dinner plates. These are in recirculated systems. Next. And also appearing in Brazil and all sorts of other countries. And so you want to think about how you want to address that issue personally. Next. And there are other labels in terms of Aquaculture Stewardship Council, Global Aquaculture Alliance, sustainable certification practices. The blue shows that only 3% of aquaculture is actually certified. Next. And most of that is in highly traded commodities, shrimp and salmon, tilapia and pangasus. But in those commodities, we still see quite a bit of red. So we still have quite a ways to go on certification and labeling, and particularly in developing countries where there's not as much incentive. Next. So I'll finish with just myth 3, that blue foods are always lower in their environmental footprint than terrestrial foods. Next. And we tend to think about this comparison, which, try next. Okay, go back. For some reason, the slide's not showing up. But what it would show on the left is the consumption of beef, poultry, pork, and seafood compared to each other. Next. And I'll just put the bottom line up front, is that poultry is the sector that is dominating in terms of per capita consumption growth across all of these areas, including seafood. And so as chefs or retailers, you put a lot of things on the menu. You put poultry, beef, and so forth on the menu, as well as fish. And that connection between poultry and fish, I think, is the most important. Our work in the environmental area showed that poultry has about the same environmental footprint as tilapia. And so, again, you want to think about the sourcing of these products. And I'll end next with just a takeaway. Unfortunately, I can't give you a silver bullet on the sustainability issues. And I know that serving your clientele responsibly is not a simple task. But it leave you with 3 messages. 1, think about the origin of where you're getting that seafood. Which country is it captured, and what practices? Second, if it's aquaculture, what are those practices? Are they using a lot of antibiotics? Are they using feeds from unsustainable sources, particularly wild fish? And third, make that comparison between other animal proteins and animal source foods. Because I think on the menu, you want everything on your menu to be sustainable, to leave it, to make it much easier for the consumer to just be able to choose whatever they want off the menu and know that it's a good product. There's a lot of sustainable terrestrial systems as well, and it just does require more digging, unfortunately. So I really want to thank you for your efforts and interest to learn more about the food you prepare and serve. Thank you so much.
Thanks for that, Roz. I think that was excellent. I think you very clearly demonstrate there's significant opportunities for bringing blue foods onto the menu, significant unknowns that we still have, but I think a lot of choices that we're going to be able to navigate and have to learn to navigate going forward. So our second speaker is Professor Chris Golden, an ecologist and epidemiologist from Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. You may know his colleague Walter Willett from the same school. Chris studies the impacts of environmental change, specifically biodiversity loss and climate change and ecosystem transformation on human nutrition and planetary health. So really a systemic thinker. But he's one of the Blue Food Assessment authors leading what, in my opinion, has been one of the key papers of the assessment, particularly on the contributions of blue foods to healthy diets. If you remember from the Lancet diet, we had this one line in terms of what our recommendation was for fish consumption. 0 to 700 grams of fish per week were within the range of healthy food consumption. I think Chris's work really has unpacked that significantly, evaluating nutritional composition and contribution of more than 3,000 blue foods, which really revealed, in my opinion, the much greater potential blue foods to contribute to healthy, and as Greg would remind us, more delicious diets. So with that, Chris, it's my great pleasure to welcome you and looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Fabrice. I guess a brief background for those who are unfamiliar. The field of planetary health explores the human health impacts of global environmental change, whether focusing on climate change, biodiversity loss, land use change like urbanization, or even fishery collapses. And planetary health scientists are really interested in documenting and characterizing the relationship between these types of ecosystem transformations and human health outcomes like nutrition. And the World Health Organization estimates that roughly 1/4 of the entire global burden of disease could be avoided through improved ecosystem management and improved management of our natural systems. And so this, to me, is a really interesting opportunity, and it's particularly relevant to our food systems, which brings together the health of people and the health of the planet. So there are so many considerations to take into account when it comes to food that it's easy to get overwhelmed and ignore all of them. And it's impossible to balance and optimize all of these considerations at once. And so you have to ultimately come to a decision of doing more right than wrong and trying not to get confused along the way. Also, you'll likely have to choose which things are more important to you as a chef or a citizen of the world. Do you want to prioritize nutritional benefits or climate change mitigation, price or justice? Again, you may not be able to choose them all, but understanding how your decisions as a chef affects these outcomes is the first step in wise planning for our food system. The main message of the Eat Lancet Commission report on healthy and sustainable diets that Fabrice mentioned really focused on trying to balance the nutritional needs of the global population while staying within the ecological limits of our planet. All food production has some sort of environmental impact, but we all need food to survive. So to create a more sustainable and healthy future diet, we must adopt a more plant-forward diet, period. With that said, there is still a very critical role for animal source foods that can both protect the planet and the health of the people living on it. The CIA's menus of change messaging very much resonates with my own. In fact, we've just had a paper that has been provisionally accepted in Nature that I'm going to give you a sneak preview of. It showcases just how the explosion of aquaculture innovation and potential reforms in fisheries management could increase the production of global seafood by roughly 15 million tons, leading to a 26% decrease in aquatic food pricing. And so you can see these increases on the figure that you have here, showing that actually aquaculture has outpaced wild capture fisheries production and is becoming the dominant form of aquatic meats globally. This increase in aquatic food production will have two separate pathways to benefit human health. There are countries characterized by undernutrition, places like Madagascar, Gabon, Suriname, etc., where the current food system does not provide enough nutrition. These are places where an increase in aquatic foods will prevent micronutrient deficiencies. And so there are also places where individuals will be facing the nutrition transition. And this is something that is also quite important. So if this future takes place, what our team has predicted that will occur is a major increase in aquatic foods that would lead to major reductions in poultry, egg, and red and processed meats. And this would have profound impacts on the health of the planet and the health of the people living on it. And it shows us that there is still a production gap that farmed aquatic foods can fill, and we must really harness their diversity to meet the nutritional needs of the world. The nutrition transition refers to the transition of developing countries from traditional diets, high in cereal, high in fiber, to more Western diets that are characterized by sugars, fats, and animal source food and processed foods. Countries like Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, islands of the South Pacific are currently in transition. And reductions in fisheries can cause a decline in traditional diets and increases in Western diets, fast foods, processed foods, and a rise in obesity and heart disease. So an increase in aquatic foods can actually prevent or reverse these trends potentially if it can help to wean people away from some of these red or processed meats, which we know are a bit unhealthier. So across Europe, most countries have inadequate seafood supplies to satisfy recommended dietary needs for a healthy diet. And you can see that in this figure here, that the production of seafood, what you have is the x-axis, and below that is everything that is exported from a given country. Above the x-axis is everything that is retained, and the yellow dot is what the country recommends people be eating. And so you can see that for many of these countries, they are retaining seafood supplies below what is actually recommended for them to eat. And this should really motivate us to increase the production of aquatic foods and ensure that they are accessible to consumers. In the United States, there's a really stark example. Because of the enormous nutritional benefits of aquatic foods in the diet, there are upwards of 50,000 deaths in the US alone attributed to low seafood consumption. And this is from a recent report from the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation that was produced by Chris Murray and his team. Following Roz's suit, I'm going to do a little bit of myth busting right now. There are broad misconceptions about the nutritional importance of seafood in the diet. And so let me explain a few basic things. First, seafood is so much more than protein, and we should stop calling it a protein. Seafood is filled with important micronutrients like iron, zinc, vitamins, and essential fatty acids. Most populations around the world have access to an adequate amount of protein, and most populations are deficient in many multiple micronutrients. And these play critical roles in growth, brain development, and immunity. Second, even in obese societies, we face deficiencies in a variety of micronutrients. So really, regardless of what type of country you're in, aquatic foods can play a really critical role in filling the nutrient gap. So here's a figure that our team produced for this paper that Fabrice was mentioning. And what it does is highlights the nutritional importance of aquatic foods in comparison to land-based meats. Aquatic foods are in blue, land-based meats are in green, and they're ranked from top to bottom in order of how nutrient dense they are. And so you can see that the ones that fall at the top are the ones that are better from a nutritional standpoint, and it's almost entirely aquatic foods at the top. So we should be focusing on things like small pelagics, the anchovies, the sardines, shellfish and bivalves, salmon, trout, etc., where they really have this kind of deep nutrient richness. And coincidentally, although Roz, I definitely acknowledge your point that there is some remaining data to be crunched, many of these specific types of fisheries products, focusing on small pelagics and bivalves and kind of salmon farming especially, are going to have a much lesser environmental footprint when properly produced than any form of terrestrial meats. And so it really seems to be this kind of win-win, both for environment and for nutrition. And then even healthier for the planet, you could focus on things like in this photo, the umibudo, or these sea grapes, which are delicious, very nutrient dense, and also have this kind of low environmental impact, of course, because they're a seaweed. Although you can never optimize across all characteristics of food, as I mentioned at the beginning, there certainly seem to be win-wins that we should be identifying, and hopefully chefs can begin to harness this knowledge in terms of designing their own menus. I really want to say thank you to all of you for listening to this type of research. It's always our ultimate hope that any of the work that we produce can be useful in some way. And so I'm hoping that this is exactly doing that. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Chris. That was fantastic. I think Greg's can give you points for the most delicious imagery. And I'm glad that as a Belgian that you featured mussels several times. So our national dish is on there. And I think your mention of diversity reminds me of one of my favorites here in the Montpellier Mediterranean region, paella, which can include quite a few of those species that you included in your dish. Our third and final speaker today is Vincent Doumeizel, and he's the Vice President of Food and Beverage and Sustainability at Lloyd Foundation. But that's probably the biggest understatement of the year. So Vincent is a tireless and hugely enthusiastic advocate for exploring and scaling the role of seaweeds in healthy, sustainable, equitable food systems. And I know that you at Means of Change have really pioneered, plant forward, that this notion that we can increase the proportion of plants on our dish. Well, Vincent's going to help us take plant forward underwater, if you will. So he brings more than 20 years of experience in the food industry. He's now the senior advisor on oceans at the United Nations Global Compact. He's partnering with the UN, with FAO, the World Bank, WWF, universities, NGOs, and large brands, and has really pushed forward the Seaweed Manifesto, a call to scaling up the seaweed industry to address some of the world's most important challenges while pursuing deliciousness. He's now co-leading the first international platform for seaweed stakeholders, the Safe Seaweed Coalition, and I hope many of you will take interest in that coalition's work. Vincent, it's great to see you again and to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Fabrice, and thank you to everyone for listening. I'm going to share my recent passion with what may be the greatest untapped resource we have on the planet, and what the journalist recently called the seaweed revolution. So it's interesting because I used to work over 20 years in the food industry. I'm absolutely not a marine biologist or specialist in the seafood industry. I used to work in the food industry with the big brands. And the big question that was mine was, how will we feed the world of tomorrow? We will know that our food supply chain today is the largest contributor of greenhouse gas. It is also the largest contributor to non-communicable disease. It is the largest contributor of social issue like modern slavery and so forth. It is one of the largest contributors to water scarcity, to soil depletion and so forth. And in the meantime, we have 1 billion people who are starving today. And the number is on the rise again. We have 1 child out of 4 which is in a state of chronic nutritional deficiency, so suffering and not growing healthy. So we've got a big problem, and I think the statement, and the worrying statement, was coming from Wageningen University, who stated that over the next 50 years or so, because of the fast-growing population, because of the change in the diets, we will have to produce as much food as we ever produced over the last 10,000 years. So 50 years, 10,000 years. That is a challenge. Will we do it on land? It's unlikely. The arable lands are not available anymore. The yields are not increasing. We are using crops for many different uses, notably biofuel and so forth. So it's unlikely we will feed the 300,000 additional people we have every day on the planet only with land production. So I think, which is why it's a revolution. And the next thing is moving to ocean. And if you look at why it is a revolution, because 12,000 years ago, we were in the prehistoric times. And we moved away from prehistory and we moved into civilization. We moved into modern human beings because we stopped being hunters, gatherers, and we became farmers. And we developed farming, but we never developed farming in the ocean. Really, we never really developed farming. Today, there's the area that is where seaweed cultivation is possible is around 66 million square kilometers in the world. The seaweed area, the ocean area where seaweed cultivation is done is less than 2,000 square kilometers. So we are nowhere. We are in the Stone Age. When it comes to aquaculture, I mean, it's kind of weird if you think about it, because 12,000 years ago, when we start to develop agriculture, I think we first learn how to grow crops, and then we learn how to feed animals with the crops. But I think in the aquaculture world, we did the other way around. We started with the animal, which is kind of weird because now you have to find ways to feed them. And once again, the lowest trophic level in the ocean is seaweed, is this microalgae which are feeding the phytoplankton and the filters, and the lowest trophic level, which are feeding the small fish and the big fish and the other fish. Without seaweed, you have nothing in the ocean. So that's the one thing. And we have, if you want to build a resilient ecosystem, and sustainable one, and a regenerative one, I think we are beyond sustainability because we have already destroyed 50% of the ocean ecosystem. I think we need to start from the beginning, from the basics. And the basics, which is sustaining the rest, is the macroalgae. So when talking about seaweed, it's a bit irrelevant because there's 12,000 types of seaweed. We have domesticated 10 of them out of 12,000, and they are very diverse. I mean, a red seaweed is genetically more different to a green seaweed than a fungi is to an elephant because of the tree of life, because of these billion years of evolution. So there are very, very multiple applications. So what can we do with seaweed, and why is it the solution to many of the problems of our generation? Well, first, we can feed people. And we did that for thousands and thousands of years. And we are human beings because we were used to eat seaweed back 20,000 years ago. America has been sapiens has established in America because of seaweed. They follow the seaweed, what is called now the kelp highway on the Pacific coastline 20,000 years ago. Studies shows that our brain is as big as it is today, and the mutation of our brain, which is much bigger compared to our structure, our mass, our body mass, has been generated because of the massive intake of polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are only available in seaweed and fish oil. So we are sapiens because we used to eat seaweed, but we lost that connection to the ocean, except in North Asia, where they keep that traditional thinking that what you eat should be close to your medicines and to what heal you. And I think that they are not very wrong on that. But anyway, so I think we lost that. And the first objective of seaweed production should be to feed people. It's a natural source, as it was said before, of iron, of proteins, of fatty acids, and vitamin B12, and many other good stuff, and no fat, and very, very positive things. If you dry it, it keeps all the nutrients, so you can easily transport them everywhere without cold chain, without anything. It's easy. It's so easy. In Japan, it is 10% of the food, and you can see health benefit by Japanese. So clear, I mean, less cardiovascular disease, higher longevity, and so forth. So let's try to eat seaweed is the first call. I mean, it's a long shot because we have lost that connection for the last 3,000 years, actually. And it's clear. So eating seaweed, I mean, that's the first application, but there's many others. You may still love a T-bone steak and so forth, and you're fine with it. So the thing is, use seaweed for animal feed. I mean, use it just for animal feed, and you will boost immune systems. There are some supply chain for animal today that have managed to cut antibiotics using seaweed as a source of feed, because seaweed will boost the immune system of the animal. So that's so strong statement. There's a lot of other applications, and one very good also is the fact that a small red seaweed called Asparagopsis taxiformis is cutting by 99% the methane emission by livestock. Methane emission by livestock is 10% of the greenhouse gas emission on our planet. So think about it. If you just give 2% of the diet as a small red seaweed to our livestock, the equivalent in terms of global emission will be just like stopping all car on the planet. Seaweed is also a biostimulant. It can replace plastic. There are fantastic plastic glass which are made out of seaweed. It can be a source to regenerate the ecosystem in the ocean, which is the most important. It can clean the ocean. It can protect shorelines and reduce erosions. It can sequester a lot of carbon. Some seaweed are growing of 30 centimeters a day and up to 60 square meters. We should stop thinking about seaweed, because seaweed, I mean, there's one thing you cannot do. It's not weed. I mean, yeah, there's one thing you cannot do with seaweed is to smoke them, I think. So, but let's call them sea vegetables, as they are in Japan and Korea. That let's call them sea forests, because we need to protect them like forests, because they are disappearing at the moment. There's a big risk. And seaweed, last but not least, is a source of revenues for coastal community. And in the emerging country, it's a source of revenues for women. 80% of the seaweed revenues goes to women in emerging countries. So it's contribute to women empowerment and gender parity. So it's such a strong statement here. So what needs to be done? There's many things that needs to be done. First of all, we need to get together. And the problem of the seaweed supply chain industry today is that it's very nascent, it's in the Stone Age, and it's totally disconnected. We have brave pioneers disconnected everywhere. So to do that, we have built together with World Bank, WWF, FAO, and many others, the first global coalition for seaweed stakeholders. And take a look at it, SaveSeaweedCoalition.org. That's the name of the website. It gathers already 400 members, so 400 stakeholders from Nestle to the primary production of seaweed. So we need to get together to put in place some good regulation to protect seaweed, to protect the environment, to make sure we are doing things right. Seaweed doesn't need land. It doesn't need fresh water. It doesn't need pesticides. And guess what? It's not gonna swim away or fly away. So it stays as it is. So it's once again one of the greatest untapped resource and a magic thing. So we need to enable that. We should get together, and as such we may be remembered as the first generation who managed to feed the entire planet with ocean production. We have to be the first generation who really know how to use the ocean. And as such, we may be remembered as the first generation who managed to feed the entire population of this planet while restoring biodiversity in the ocean and while mitigating climate change and while alleviating poverty. I think our generation deserves, the next generation at least, these young people, they deserve something else than being the COVID generation. They deserve something else, and seaweed is a great news for all of them. We have to be the first generation who domesticates the ocean. We have to be the seaweed. That's why it's a revolution, because we have to connect again land and ocean. And as such, we will address some of the challenge of our generation, and all together, and it can only be all together. I really think we will make it. Thank you very much for this.
Thanks, Vincent. Tireless as usual, and bringing us out of the Stone Age. I think flagging another area of pioneering work, of opportunities, particularly in terms of the role that seaweed might play, both as an ingredient in livestock, but also as a direct consumption by humans. Let's bring on the other two panelists, and I think we have some time left for some question and answer. Roz is back, Chris is back. Great. Thanks to all of you for your presentations. I've got a couple of questions already coming in. So let's gear you up with the first one, which is asking, particularly for you, Chris and Roz, what would be your top 3 to 5 blue foods that you'd like to see chefs focus more on, and maybe give us an idea of why you might choose those 3 to 5. Chris, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. I would say that the number one would be small pelagics, and I realize that Europe is already doing a good job of highlighting these, but the US and many other countries are not focusing on these species. So the anchovies, sardines, herring, these are incredibly nutritious, really delicious, and should be featured more on US menus. Also, bivalves are one of those absolute win-wins for environmental sustainability and for nutrition. I would also say, kind of with a caveat, that properly farmed salmons and trouts would be something that I would definitely highlight. And so to ensure that you're getting sustainable sourcing on those types of products. And then lastly, particularly in a follow-up to Vincent's great presentation, I would say that seaweeds would definitely be something that I would recommend highlighting. It seems like we've only really scratched the surface in terms of the myriad ways that this could be used.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for that, Chris. So Roz, what would be your recommendations?
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with Chris, but I would add that I would look at the sourcing again of where you're getting the pelagics and where you're getting the bivalves, because when we look at demand overall around the world, we have seen situations where we have great demand, for example, in Europe for bivalves and small pelagics, but then those are being imported from countries that used to eat these fish as their sustainable and staple foods. whether it's Chile eating bivalves or West Africa eating some of the small pelagics. And the pricing and the value has caused that export market to actually overshadow domestic consumption of these. So when I tend to look at global food security, so I also want to think about how this is impacting pricing and value and the choices that countries are making in terms of exporting versus promoting blue foods within their own countries. But I think those are the key ones. I also really agree that putting shrimp and salmon on the menu is absolutely important. That's what people want to eat. That's what they want to see on the menu. And there are many more sustainable ways to do this and a lot of progress. So let's reward that. And finally with Vincent on the seaweed, my main point was that the value wasn't there for a lot of producers. And so finding ways to get that, you're seeing it most successfully in China, those large scale systems. The market's got to really change to make this happen. But I think so many consumers would love to explore that option.
Yeah, great answers, both of you. I've got a question that's asking about how worried we should be about the content of heavy metals and radiation in seafoods. And I think to your point, Roz, people are concerned about site-specific impacts, impacts in the Gulf of Mexico and the vaquita population and gill nets. Maybe that first one, concerns around heavy metals, and then how might you recommend that people navigate the site-specific or production-specific questions as we proceed? Is there a source, is there a place, or how can people make more informed choices, particularly on the practices and locations?
So should I start?
Yeah, please, Roz, and then we'll go to Chris.
Okay. I think that's an excellent question. It always comes up. Food safety issues more generally are really important when it comes to blue foods. And the lower you're eating on the trophic chain, the less accumulation you're going to have of heavy metals and dioxins, other things that you don't want in your seafood. So again, seaweed or mollusks, those are going to have less bioaccumulation, but you do have to worry about they're absorbing nutrients in the ambient environment, not using feed, but they are absorbing other things as well. And so you want to be sure the biosafety protocols in the country where it's being produced are up to speed and, where you actually want to eat those materials.
Yeah, just a few things to add on to what Roz is saying. I think that most of the epidemiological evidence shows that broadly on a population scale, the benefits of the nutrients that fish and other forms of aquatic foods provide greatly outweigh the risk of contaminants. And so I think that is kind of a basic message. Though with certain types of fish species, you're definitely increasing your risk for these contaminants. And so this is not just things like mercury, but you can also think of antibiotics, you can think of microplastics. And so much of this is going to be highly variable depending on where the forms of aquatic foods were produced. And so this gets back to Roz's original point of knowing where you are sourcing these aquatic foods is incredibly important to providing safe, just, and nutritious meals to your consumers. And so one project that we are actively working on is this entire database that we've made of aquatic foods that now has 3,750 species in all of their nutrient composition. We want to link that together with geographically explicit contaminants data to then help inform people how best to choose across fish for kind of tailoring it to a nutritional experience while minimizing some of these food safety risks as well.
Great, that's really useful, Chris. And I think important that you're signaling that there is interest and ambition in the research community to try to help navigate some of these challenges. Vincent, we've got a question for you. We're being asked whether it's practical to introduce seaweed to livestock on a mass scale. And is there enough available in the ocean to sustain this, or will it cause more unintended consequences? And I'm quickly, before I hand over to you, I said, if we think about this question within a systems-based approach, I think if we pair it with the reduced consumption or healthy consumption of meat, I think that also gets us to ask, it frames the question of how much or what is the scale that we need to be implementing this intervention with. Vincent?
Well, first of all, I think the basics as animal feed is to feed ocean animal with ocean crops, So feed fish with seaweed somehow, because there will be in between. But let's move back to a permaculture in the ocean with fish, seaweed, and shellfish and sea cucumbers, and all working together in a regenerative mode. I think that's the first point for animal feed. Then if you want to feed livestock and cut methane emission, which is a very good idea once again, the thing is that it has been done for centuries in many countries, many countries in the north, notably. We have a lot of seaweed available. The availability of seaweed is not really the problem, and it has mostly a restorative effect. True, we perceive seaweed quite negatively sometime because of all these invasive species, the sargassum or the seaweed tides that we face, but they are non-domesticated seaweed. So as soon as you try to domesticate it and manage the ecosystem, there's no record so far of invasive seaweed that went out of control while they were domesticated, notably in Asia. So but point taken, we need to work very, very closely on that, and the basic remit of this coalition that we have established is to work on the environmental safety related to seaweed cultivation, because the worst thing that can happen is really to realize that the seaweed scaling up the seaweed industry is detrimental to the environment, which is once again unlikely. And all of the science so far, because the manifesto that you are talking is science-based, and a lot of universities partnered with us, the science shows that it is restoring ecosystem in the ocean. It is cleaning the water. It is so. The tendency is going in the other way around, and we have not started to cultivate seaweed. So saying that there's not available resource, let's start to cultivate it first, because really, once again, we are cultivating 2,000 square kilometers out of 65 million square kilometers. So I think we have a substantial growth avenue. I would like to add just one word on this, on what was said on the chef. More and more chefs are very interested with seaweed because it's a new taste, it's a new flavor. It's full of glutamate, which is only available in seaweed, the umami, as they call it Japanese, and it's very interesting. It's in terms of new territories for gastronomy. It's very, very interesting, and we have a 3-star Michelin chef who is using 20 different types of seaweed. So it's quite cool. On the economic aspect, I think the problem is that we are not yet there in terms of the bioraffinery process, how to process seaweed after harvesting. We only use it for one commodity, basically, so far. So it's carrageenan or agar-agar. There's many more things we could do with seaweed. Actually, a couple of weeks ago, we discovered that we can restore main sites using proteins from seaweed. So, just as an illustration of the unlimited potential of application that we can have, splitting the various compounds of the seaweed into different one and get a very strong economic return on that.
Great, thanks for that, Vincent. I think flagging in the opportunity, but also this is such a novel space that I think even questions about what would be regenerative seaweed production is still an open question. What are the environmental guardrails that we should be putting in place is also an area that I think many of us are wanting to investigate further within this potential. But Roz, there's a question that many of the group are asking in terms of, again, how do we navigate some of this complexity? And is there alignment across the NGOs in terms of what might be sustainable practices? Would you recommend one or another, or group of NGO recommendations, or what would be your recommendation for how chefs might engage with individuals or associations who can provide guidance?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The chart that I showed, that the 3%, Seafood Watch had put that together across the Aquaculture Stewardship Council, the Global Aquaculture Alliance, Seafood Watch. So that combined the major ones, but there are a lot of more localized certification processes starting up. I think if I was a chef, I'd want to personally develop a relationship with some of the scientific advisors, say for Seafood Watch, to get the clear story offline on what's being considered. The main things you're going to see in there are the feed sourcing and the habitat destruction that is going along with this. Those are probably the two main things that you're going to pick up. There's also issues of antibiotic use and management of pest control. Really, even in seaweed control, even in seaweed production, there's a lot of challenges with preventing diseases in this. And so how that all plays out is really important. I think many consumers really care about. antibiotics and antimicrobials in their food. So I think those are the main things that are coming out. I personally go to the Seafood Watch because it's right down the street from me. And I think they're a little bit more rigorous than the Global Aquaculture Alliance, which is really supporting the industry. I think they set a higher bar, so I would start with them as a group that oversees many aspects.
Fantastic. Thanks, Roz. That's certainly a helpful answer to get us started. But one last question for any of you or all of you is that, chefs, of course, are fantastic spokespeople to consumers. They really have an ability to tell the story of a food. I've got one question. If any of you have invasive species stories, is there an opportunity for chefs to help conserve biodiversity by making use of invasive species as a source of food? As an example, or do you have other recommendations for the kinds of narratives that chefs might be able to bring to the table in terms of raising awareness while presenting both healthy and innovative foods? Any final thoughts on narratives for chefs?
I mean, in terms of the narrative on invasive species, the one danger of that is that then you're sort of validating that the invasive species, you're allowing those to occur, so somehow you have to get at managing those invasive species and not just getting complete value out of them. But I agree with Vincent and Chris. The story around what's on that menu is the most interesting. And whether it's seaweeds or salmon or shrimp and everything in between, for the chef to be able to come out or have a little story on the menu as to why this was selected and what it's doing for the consumer or to the environment or global food security is a great narrative just to even have a line in there. Consumers love this stuff. Even consumers that are at street stalls love this. It doesn't have to be at a high-end restaurant.
Great, thanks, Roz. Chris, Vincent, any parting thoughts?
I would just echo what. Oh.
Go ahead, Chris.
I would just echo what Roz was saying. I think that I saw a video that even a company like Chipotle put out about the way that they source the materials that are going into that. And you just feel this much deeper connection to a company that cares about those types of issues and stories. And so to weave into a mussels dish or to weave into the selection around, okay, of these 3,000 plus fish species, this is why I chose this one. I think that understanding that the chef cares about that will then make the consumer care. And so really trying to highlight those narratives would be wonderful.
I like that the chef cared, the consumer should care as well. Fantastic. Vincent?
No, I subscribe to what was said. I mean, we should not, developing a narrative for the chef with invasive species will be to validate a deviation, something that went wrong. I mean, we should not have invasive species. Invasive species, when it comes to seaweed, at least are the result of pollutions, over a lot of pollutions, and which are creating this proliferation of seaweed. And you should not validate this pollution. You should find a way to stop it, but you should not validate this pollution or either invasive species which are not native and that you have integrated in an ecosystem that was not theirs, which is same. I mean, you should not accept that. Full stop. So we should we should become mature and educated. We should become civilized with the ocean and deal with that with a lot of maturity as an ecosystem, and it will provide a lot of resources, a lot of ideas for the chefs. And once again, when you eat seaweed, you sequester carbon. Is the only food that reverses climate change, because not only it's low emission, but it sequesters carbon in the ocean as it grows. So once again, it's a very strong narrative as such. It's good for your health. It's good for the planet. I mean, that's a strong narrative.
There you have it, Jackie. I want to thank the three panelists, Roz, Chris, and Vincent. It's a pleasure having a conversation with you. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your work. And I really appreciate what you've been able to share with all of our chefs. Over to you, Jackie.
Thank you so much, Fabrice. And we will get a chance to hear more from Fabrice in our next session.